The Symbolism of Pluto. Pluto in astrology is an archetype. See our video on archetypes. The archetype of intense and violent destruction. But it also symbolises regeneration, transformation and rebirth. It is like the phoenix, burning down what does not work in order to rise again from the ashes. But the destruction can be horrific, whether it applies to a nation, city, or person. Greek and Roman mythology and the naming of lumps of rock. Pluto, the physical planet, was named after the Roman god of the underworld, also known as Hades in Greek mythology. It was only discovered on February 18, 1930, by the Lowell Observatory. It is surrounded by millions of other similar pieces of rock because it is in the Kuiper Belt. The name Pluto was proposed by Venetia Burney, 1918 to 2009, an 11-year-old schoolgirl in Oxford, England. She suggested it in a conversation with her grandfather, Falconer Madan, a former librarian at the University of Oxford's Bodleian Library. He passed the name to astronomy professor Herbert Hall Turner, who cabled it to colleagues in the United States. Out of a list of 3 names, Minerva, Cronus and Pluto, Pluto received a unanimous vote from astronomers, not astrologers. In August 2006, the International Astronomical Union, the IAU, downgraded the status of Pluto to that of dwarf planet. Astrologically, however, it stayed, as did its name. Pluto has 5 moons, all of whose names were chosen to match that of Pluto. Charon and Styx. Charon was the ferryman of Hades, who carried the souls of the newly deceased across the river Styx. Nyx. The Nixi, or Nyx, are shape-shifting water spirits in Germanic mythology, although Nyx in Greek mythology is the female personification of night. Hydra in Greek legend was a gigantic water snake-like monster with 9 heads. And Kerberos was the gigantic 3-headed hound of Hades, which guarded the gates of the underworld. So as we can see, the names given to all these lumps of rock and gas are entirely mythological, and all related to death and hell. Is this true of other astrological systems, or is this just a Western flight of fancy? Let us turn to another astrology system that at first appears to be entirely different from the Western one because it has evolved around another culture, and see what happens. And we will use Pluto again to demonstrate. Naadi Astrology. Naadi Astrology, Naadi Jyotisa, comes from Tamil Nadu and adjacent regions in southern India. And Pluto, the god in Indian Naadi Astrology, is called Yama. Yama is the god of death and justice, responsible for the dispensation of law and punishment. The mace, or sword of justice, is his insignia. And whereas the West emphasises rebirth as a transformative experience with a phoenix, the East effects a rebirth via flames. So mythologically, Pluto equals Hades equals Yama, and it may be added the Norse equivalent was Ymir. And on looking further, we can conclude that the archetype for rebirth, transformation, death, and destruction is the same everywhere. And this puppet is from Java. Different names, different insignia, different iconography, but the same meaning. And this painting is Chinese. 10 Kings of Hell, Yantuo Wang by Lu Xingzhong. But none of the people who had this archetype knew of the existence of the lump of rock we now call Pluto until an 11-year-old girl named it. Remember, this lump of rock could have been called anything. Why was it named after one of the most important gods in the pantheon? The god of destruction and rebirth, and of destruction so enormous it might signal a total wipeout. A tiny lump of very pretty rock gets given a name indicating major, even devastating change. And the names of its moons all related to hell and death. Why? And the answer might simply be that this was a terrible mistake. And astrologers everywhere are prophesying destruction, catastrophe, and devastation, with the subconscious effect that this then happens, because people are being told it will happen, so they make it happen. Naming and names. Literally, tens of thousands of years ago, men were trying to work out what the systems of the universe were. They noticed that the moon and sun both had considerable influence on us as humans and the rest of the planet's inhabitants. Plant cycles, tides, menstruation, all seemed to be affected by heavenly bodies. So men and women started to keep records. They were in some senses the first scientists. So important were these records and so complex that the record keepers became priest kings and high priestesses in due course. They would meticulously note events that had taken place, the type of event and the consequences, how the events played out in a cause-effect chain, but at the same time they would make a note of all the star positions they could see, noting dates, times, angles, and so on. This is the Jantar Mantar in Jaipur. If a similar sequence of events, in other words, type of event, type of participants, and types of outcome were seen, and the same star pattern, this was noted. This is Stonehenge. And this is the Marrakech Observatory in Iran. The observatory was constructed in the 13th century and was said to house a staff of at least 10 astronomers and a librarian who was in charge of the library, which contained over 40,000 books. And this continued for eons as patterns were built up. A pattern that repeated with regularity was then given a name. If the script or story that was played out was complex, then an exciting myth was invented to help people remember the pattern. And eventually, a chart emerged, with star patterns all over the sky, representing the events that had been noted and how they played out as myths and symbols, archetypal figures, and gods. The entire night sky is thus covered astrologically with a vast collection of patterns made into scripts. In other words, Western astrologers once considered all these scripts to be the great work. The story of Audionautix is written in the stars, but only by comparing your chart with the archetype will you know whether you are actually on this known script. See our theatre video. Sometimes the symbols and scripts don't even map very well onto the stars, and there has in the past been a wonderful flowering of artists who have produced their own pictures, incorporating the star patterns. But the naming and juxtapositions are obviously key, and this is why complex observatories were built that would last lifetimes, and were all carefully aligned so that men could measure. Astronomers measured and astrologers named and noted events. Sometimes, like Kepler, they did both. But then, disaster. They split into two, and the science of why and how they were named was lost. So that an 11-year-old girl was able to name a tiny dwarf planet after the god of destruction. Cries of pseudo-science. All the archetypal entities, Neptune, Uranus and Pluto, are recognized worldwide, albeit by gods having different names, and the naming of star clusters, planets and stars was a perfectly valid way of teaching these archetypes, especially to societies of nomads who could neither read or write, and the eventual keeping of records by the newly literate to capture celestial events and their correlation with earthly events was a perfectly valid endeavour. Where the cries of pseudoscience can be heard is in those who point out that attributing events to the movements of planets and constellations is ridiculous. We do not want to get into this argument. What is important is that man once believed this, and because of these beliefs built astounding observatories like Stonehenge and Göbekli Tepe that we will never understand until we embrace these belief systems. We have no need to disparage or support them. They were man's first attempts at science. For example, this may be Leo on a pillar at Göbekli Tepe. Any archaeologist is thus duty-bound to study these systems in order to understand the sites he unearths and the artifacts he finds. See the video on the symbolism of the pig, as the boar was a very key totem animal. Both the Picts and Chinese recognized a boar constellation. In traditional Chinese astronomy, the 9 stars from Andromeda, including Beta Andromedae, Mu Andromedae, and Nu Andromedae, along with 7 stars from Pisces, formed a wild boar. Science these days is still using heuristics, cause and effect, to come to conclusions, and often with far fewer observations. We have not really moved on at all. And it may well be that the mundane planets, Jupiter, Saturn and Venus, Mars and Mercury, the Moon and Sun, do interact with one another enough to mean that far more systems than we ever realised are affected by the planets and their positions, and that when Jupiter is aligned with Mars under Aquarius, weather events in particular may change quite dramatically. We may find that gravity exerts a good deal more influence than we thought, and is better called something else.